So let's continue on talking about how we process the plant and extract the cannabinoids from it. And we'll also talk about different species, subspecies, and what hemp is. So harvest. Harvesting is when you have those beautiful flowers, when they reach their peak cannabinoid content, you want to harvest them. And you have a window for this. You can usually tell when they're ready when the pistils turn from white to a dark yellow or reddish, and the trichomes, they start to look more milky rather than clear. So you're going to trim it. You could do that before or after you dry it. And you could do it by hand if you're doing artisanal cannabis, or by machine if you have a really large operation. And then you're going to dry the bud. You're going to dry the flower. And this is good. You're going to hang them upside down and dry them. And obviously this has to be in a room with low humidity and of a certain temperature, lower light. You want to have good airflow. And this is going to concentrate the cannabinoids down there in the flower, in the bud. And it helps to remove the chlorophyll taste. The chlorophyll is what makes plants green, if you remember from, again, 8th grade science class. Depending on how you extract your cannabinoids, depending on if you're using flour or if you're going to make an oil out of it, some extraction methods are going to leave more of a chlorophyll taste. We'll talk about that. But drying it will also concentrate them, bring out the aroma and the flavor of the flower. And you can cure it. And what you do to cure it is you put it in an airtight container in an area that's dark and cool. And a few times a day, at first you open up and let the moisture escape, and then you close it up again. And then after a while, you do that a few times a week, depending on artisanal you're going to make this. And it helps the flower to dry better and dry more uniformly, helps preserve the natural cannabinoids and the terpenes. Now I got to see all this. I've gone on a couple tours of different grow facilities. This was a wonderful facility up in Massachusetts. It's the Garden Remedies. And in the cannabis certificate program that I lead, I have the boys from, they're much younger than me, so the young men from Garden Remedies come talk about how they cultivate and extract a cannabis plant. And so this is me very happy in a room full of plants. This is, look at that, look at the size of this. And the lights have to be kept a certain level. It just had a beautiful facility. So I had to take a picture of a bud. There's big old bags, big bags of cannabis. And I brought my sister on the tour, so there we are, smiling in the room of the big bags of cannabis. So if you can go on a tour, it's a cool thing. It's a cool thing to see what they're doing. All right. So we've dried our flower, we've cured it, and if you're going to just smoke flower, great, you got it, you're done. But if you're going to extract certain cannabinoids, if you're going to make an oil, for instance, to be vaped or to be put in edibles, you want to extract whichever oil or whichever cannabinoids and terpenes you want to get. So that's the extraction, is getting out your chosen cannabinoids and terpenes. And so a couple terms: full spectrum. Full spectrum. That's when you want to preserve the full cannabinoid and terpene content as much as you can of what's originally in the raw plant. Now there's a lot of substances in this plant. I think we're up to 144 different cannabinoids and a whole bunch of terpenes. So as far as we know, you're going to be able to preserve the content of the raw plant. Broad spectrum, you may have heard that with regards to CBD, that retains a whole bunch of the phytocannabinoids. A phytocannabinoid comes from the plant. So phytocannabinoid is THC and CBD, CBG, CBDA, all of those, but no THC if you're just trying to extract out the CBD. And an isolate is when you're going to be very specific. You're not going to have the terpenes. You're not going to have a full spectrum. You just want to isolate out your THC or just isolate out your CBD, for instance. So there's a number of ways to extract. And again, extraction is just getting those cannabinoids and terpenes out of the plant material. You don't want the plant material, you just want the chemicals. So there's some non-solvent extraction and there's solvent-based extraction. And we'll start with the non-solvent extraction. Main one here is supercritical CO2 extraction. And this one uses very high pressure and temperature in order to get the cannabinoids out. What you do is you take CO2 gas and you compress it and heat it and makes it into a fluid form. And actually they use that process to decaffeinate coffee and to get vanilla extract. But this highly pressurized hot liquid CO2 is run through the cannabis, and you do have to do this several times. You recover your CO2 and you pass it back through the cannabis. You have to do it several times because it's actually not a very good solvent, but it's clean. So you get this highly pressurized liquid form of CO2, you rush it, push it through your cannabis several times, and through that way you extract your cannabinoids. And so some advantages of this: it is clean. It is the cleanest method. There's no hexane, there's no butane, there's none of those solvents that you have to clean out of there. It doesn't leave any harmful residue. And when your extraction is complete, the CO2 just dissipates away. So clean method, and you can preserve the terpenes by doing this. Disadvantage, you have to do it many times. CO2 is not a very good solvent, but what I mean by that is that the cannabinoids really don't dissolve in it very well. So it's not a great solvent. It takes a long time to do this. You have to pass the CO2 over and over the cannabinoids. And it's expensive. You need expensive equipment, and it's potentially dangerous because it runs at a very high pressure, a high temperature. You have to make sure you maintain your machine because it can be potentially dangerous. So there's just a supercritical CO2 extractor. All right, another method is solvent-based extraction. And there's a number of ways you can go with this. And what you do here, you add the solvent to dissolve the cannabinoids. And then you you evaporate out that solvent. So let's say you use butane or used ethanol. That's going to evaporate out, just leaving the concentrated oil that was dissolved in your solvent. And there's a whole lot of different solvents that can extract cannabinoids from the plant, but for human consumption, we really only use a small handful. So let's talk about the hydrocarbon extraction first. These are nonpolar. What that means, basically, that means it's fat soluble. So the fat soluble, nonpolar, fat soluble substances such as cannabinoids and terpenes easily dissolve. They're very fat soluble. They dissolve in your butane or propane or hexane or naphtha or whatever you're using. They easily are pulled out of the plant material and dissolve into these solvents. And some advantages to this: these are very effective solvents. It's nonpolar, and so is the cannabinoids, or the fat-soluble cannabinoids are easily dissolved in these solvents. And then you can gently remove the cannabinoids from this without extracting a lot of the plant material. You don't really want your chlorophyll or other plant material in there. So they're real effective at just getting out the cannabinoids and the terpenes. This is not as expensive as supercritical CO2. It doesn't have as much pressure as the supercritical CO2, but propane is flammable, and butane and hexane, these are flammable and potentially carcinogenic. You have to make sure you remove the solvent. You can't leave the hexane in with your cannabinoid oil. So you have to make sure you remove the solvent, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So that is one method of extraction. Another solvent-based extraction, this would be a polar version. Polar is going to be water soluble, and that's ETOH, is ethanol. That's alcohol extraction or ethanol extraction. And that is going to extract both the non-polar compounds, such as the cannabinoids and the terpenes, and polar, like chlorophyll and some of the other plant materials. So this can give a strong strong taste. Not everyone appreciates it, and so you really want to get the chlorophyll taste out of there afterwards. An advantage to ethanol extraction: it's safer than butane, right? And you get to retain more of the terpenes, which are a little more water soluble. It's cheaper and it's easier than the CO2, supercritical CO2, and it's not as flammable as using the hydrocarbon solvent extraction. but you have to deal with the chlorophyll taste. Now you can do that by chilling the ethanol to minus 40 degrees or less. So you can bypass some of that chlorophyll taste, but then you have the challenge of getting it to such a low temperature. It's good you don't have to worry about the pressure, but you can work around it for sure. And so there's, that is going to be the hydrocarbon, the butane, non-polar, what's the word I'm thinking of, solvent, and here's ethanol solvent extraction. And then with both of them, you have to remove the solvents. And there's a number of ways to do it. You can dry it in this vacuum drying oven, decarboxylation, distillation. So there's ways to get it out. All right, so we've now gotten out our cannabinoids and hopefully our terpenes from our plant material. Let's move on and talk about different strains is such a tough word. Let's go with chemovar. Terminology with cannabis is always evolving, but let's just talk about the plant. Different species, subspecies, strains of the plant. Cannabis sativa. What that is, it's tall, slender version of the cannabis plant. All these are cannabis. They have thinner, narrower, lighter green leaves. And this grows best in tropical and semi-tropical and warmer environments. And they say that sativa is from the Sanskrit word for daytime. The thought is that sativa plants are more uplifting, more cerebral, less sleepy than indica plants. So cannabis indica, technically the difference is they look different. The leaves, the plant itself is shorter and the leaves are wider and darker green and broader leaves. And this grows better in cooler climates. And the word is that indica is the Sanskrit word for nighttime. So the prevailing thought is that sativas are uplifting and cerebral and indica is more couch lock and more sleepy and relaxing. There's another one, Cannabis ruderalis. That is maybe a separate species, maybe a subspecies. Again, it's short, it's sturdy, has a shorter growing season, and less THC. All right, so it has naturally low concentrations of THC. But the main difference is that sativa is taller, thinner, lighter green leaves, and indica is a shorter plant with broader, darker green leaves. But we all know that sativa is uplifting and cerebral and indica is relaxing and sedating. And that really, you can't say that anymore. You can't generalize too much because pretty much all plants are hybrids now. Used to be sativa, and then actually it's one of the reasons we could have cannabis growing all over, because when you mix the sativa with an indica, because it's better in cooler climates rather than, we're not tropical, it allowed it to be grown in all 50 states. But really all of them are kind of hybrids at this point. There's a few plants called land races that are like the original, but really almost all plants now are a combination of sativa and indica, and really with a little ruderalis thrown in, so you have a shorter growth cycle. What you want to look at, don't assume, don't go into a dispensary or whatever and say, I want an indica because I want to be sleepy or sedated. You have to look at so many other things. Yep, the THC-CBD ratio plays a role, less than we thought. Terpenes. There may be a difference in sativa and indica, and if there is, it's probably due to which plant has which terpenes. We'll talk about that in a later video, but myrcene, for instance, is a terpene that can make you sleepy. Pinene might wake you up a little more. So if sativa naturally has more pinene, indica naturally has more myrcene, that might be where that perception came, but you cannot assume an indica is sedating. All really indica means is that it's short and bushier, and sativas are taller and thinner leaves. So don't make the assumption that this is the truth, that this is always what's going on. Other things you have to consider is, what was the light cycle? You harvested, when did you harvest it? If you harvested a little bit earlier, you're going to have a different level of THC and CBD. How's it grown? What's the humidity? All these things matter. And another important thing is, how do you expect to feel? That matters. If you give somebody a plant And they use it, and you tell them it's an indica, they're like, oh yeah, I can't get off the couch, I'm all sleepy. But it really was a sativa. That can totally happen. What you are expecting to feel has a very strong effect. All right, the last thing we will talk about in this video is hemp. Hemp is one of the oldest domesticated crops known to man. The oldest relic of human industry is the scrap of hemp fabric that dates back 10,000 years. So we know this has been cultivated, or at least used, for since the Stone Age, for thousands of years. And hemp is an amazingly useful plant. Now, hemp is cannabis. I want to be clear on that. Cannabis. So when we're talking about cannabis, you get marijuana, you get the psychoactive properties from, and you get or hemp. They're both the cannabis plant, but there's different genetics, certainly different uses, different chemical makeup, and you cultivate them differently, but they are the same species. Now, the way I think about this is, Michael Phelps and I are the same species, but we look very different, and we have very different function, and we have very, very different chemically and genetically. Same species, though. Similar with a cannabis plant grown for its medicinal purposes and hemp. Same species, different look, different uses. So hemp is used more for fiber, for fuel, for the seeds, and you can get CBD from it. And that's still really in many plants, the only way you can get, in many states, the only way you can get CBD. It has higher CBD. Hemp has higher CBD. To be classified as hemp, you have to have less than 0.3% THC, and that can be a challenge. We're actually having a lot of trouble growing hemp in Florida for a number of reasons. It's humid. We're getting a lot of molds in the hemp that they're trying to grow, and because of the light cycles, because you typically grow hemp outside, because the light cycles and because of the pollination from other plants, we're having trouble, and a lot of the growth, a lot of the plots they're trying to grow have gone hot. And what that means is it's gone above 0.3% THC. You have to destroy your entire crop of hemp when that happens. So it's problematic here in Florida. Other states have had much better success. Now back to hemp. It's often the male plant, and they are tall. And it's mostly the stem, the stalk. Look at the difference. It's not this short, bushy plant with flower, with bud. And you can grow a lot more hemp plants in an acre than you could grow medicinal cannabis plants, because those are shorter and bushier with the flower, and you have to be individually take care of them. And they're much more high maintenance, the medicinal cannabis. Hemp, you can grow a lot more, you don't have to take care of it as much, and it's the long, skinny stems, because it's the stem that you want. I don't know if you can hear my dog dreaming in the background. He's making dreamy, snuffly sounds. But he's a beautiful dog, so listen to my dog. All right, let's move it on. Hemp is a wonderful plant. It's ecologically great. It's low maintenance. It's very adaptable. You can grow it in a wide array of soil types and altitudes and weather conditions and stuff in Florida, but you can. It handles stress very well. It doesn't require that much water or pesticides, and it actually detoxifies the soil. So if you grow it in certain soils, it can take some of the toxins out of there. Now be careful if you're getting your CBD from hemp that's grown in soil with all sorts of pesticides crap in it. We don't know how much of that gets into the CBD. But it can also prevent erosion of soil, and you can grow the plants very, very close together. And it has a fairly short growth cycle, shorter than cotton, shorter certainly than trees that you make flour with. Now, some of the uses, many uses. Seed, hemp seed, very nutritionally dense. It's a really good source of protein and fiber, of B vitamins, has magnesium and iron and zinc, has essential fatty acids, a really good ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. It's a very nutritionally dense food. And you can use these hemp seed for food, or to make an oil, for body care, to make a lotion, detergents, ink, varnish. Oh, that should be paint. not pain. So it's not for pain, it's for paint. But a lot of uses for the seed. Now the stalk, so many things. You can make clothing out of it, and shoes, and rope and canvas, paper. Until about 1860 or so, 90% of the world's supply of paper came from hemp. Cardboard, biofuel, mud insulation, I'm just reading you here, and hempcrete. So the fiber. Fiber on an annual basis, 1 acre of hemp will produce as much fiber as 2 to 3 acres of cotton, and hemp is stronger and softer. It doesn't mildew. It grows in more climates. It doesn't take as much water or fertilizer, and you don't need the pesticides. It's easier to grow, easier for the environment. Paper from the stalk. 1 acre of hemp will produce as much paper as 2 to 4 acres of 20-year-old trees. So much better for the environment. And hemp paper, it's thicker, and you can recycle it more, and it doesn't take as much toxic chemicals to make, and it's much shorter growth cycle. And then there's hempcrete as well. Hempcrete fascinates me. Well, maybe we can get, if you take the Cannabis Business class, Bob Clayton, who built a hempcrete house, comes and talks about that. But what it does, you can't just build your house out of that, because it's only about 1/20th as strong as concrete. You need another frame of material to support the vertical load of the hempcrete. But it's good for earthquake areas. It's fairly fire resistant, ironically enough. But it's kind of amazing. It's something we should certainly look into. Now, to close it out, the legal status of hemp changes all the time. In 2018, the Farm Bill legalized industrial hemp in the United States. Until then, you couldn't grow hemp in most of the states. And so this opened it up to use for food and fiber and pharmaceutical to get the CBD out of there. But it's still state by state. So not all states have declared hemp to be legal. I think Idaho and Mississippi are still holding out, and they do not allow cultivation of hemp. But this really changes from day to day. And the last thing I'm just going to show you, I can't show you this video because of copyright. If you have Netflix, then go to Netflix, and there's a series called Explained, and there's one episode called Weed. Look for it. It's great, and it talks a lot about hemp and where it got to be today and what it is and the differences. It's a very good video to like. So Netflix, Explained, Weed. All right, let's close it out.